In the first 10 days of Operation Barbarossa, German forces destroyed more Soviet aircraft, captured more prisoners, and advanced further into hostile territory than any army in the history of warfare had ever managed in the same span of time. This is the story of 5 tactics that made the opening phase of Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union appear, to soldiers and observers on both sides, genuinely unstoppable. A summer of victories so overwhelming that they nearly obscured, for months, the strategic gamble underneath them that would eventually cost Germany the entire war. It had just started with such devastating early success. On June the 22nd, 1941, more than 3 million German and Axis soldiers crossed the Soviet border along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. And within the campaign's opening weeks, German forces had encircled and destroyed entire Soviet armies, advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, and inflicted casualties on a scale that genuinely staggered military observers around the world, friend and enemy alike. That opening summer of victories, whatever ultimately became of the invasion by winter, rested on 5 specific tactical approaches that, working in combination rather than in isolation, produced results neither side had fully anticipated when the campaign began that June morning. Tactic number 1, and it was the same doctrine that had already carried German arms through Poland and France in the 2 years before Barbarossa began. A proven approach refined across 2 entirely separate campaigns rather than improvised for this invasion alone. German commanders concentrated their armoured and motorised divisions into powerful, narrow spearheads rather than spreading tanks evenly across the entire front, driving those concentrated panzer groups deep into Soviet territory well ahead of the slower-moving infantry divisions that followed on foot and by horse-drawn transport. A deliberate gap between fast and slow elements of the same army that would have terrified a more conventional military doctrine. That concentration of force let German armour punch through Soviet defensive lines at a small number of carefully chosen points, then continue advancing rapidly into open country behind those lines rather than pausing to fight a continuous, grinding battle along the entire length of the frontier, the way the previous World War's own fighting had so often unfolded across static, entrenched positions that took months rather than days to shift. Soviet commanders, trained to expect a more evenly distributed attack across a broad front, repeatedly found themselves outmanoeuvred by Panzer spearheads that had already advanced dozens of miles behind their own positions before local commanders even fully understood where the true weight of the German attack had actually gone that particular day. A confusion compounded by the fact that Soviet defensive doctrine itself had not yet fully absorbed the lessons German forces had already demonstrated so decisively in Poland and France. Tactic number 2, and it turned those armoured breakthroughs into some of the largest single captures of prisoners in the history of warfare up to that point. German panzer groups, having broken through Soviet lines at multiple points along the front, drove not simply forward, but around the flanks of the Soviet forces they had bypassed, meeting other German spearheads advancing from a different direction to close a ring around hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers at once before those soldiers had any real opportunity to withdraw or reorganize behind a new defensive line. That tactic, which German soldiers themselves called a Kesselschlacht, a cauldron battle, produced catastrophic results for Soviet forces caught inside the encirclement at Bialystok and Minsk in the campaign's opening weeks, and again at Smolensk shortly afterward, each encirclement trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops with their own supply lines and avenues of retreat completely cut off before slower-moving German infantry divisions arrived to reduce the pocket and force a mass surrender from soldiers who had run out of food, ammunition, and any realistic hope of relief arriving in time to save them. Soviet forces caught inside these pockets frequently attempted desperate breakout attacks, throwing whatever remaining armour and infantry they had left against the thinnest sections of the German ring in hopes of punching a corridor back to friendly lines. And while some of these attempts achieved partial, temporary success, the overwhelming majority failed against a combination of German firepower and the sheer exhaustion of Soviet units that had already been fighting, retreating, and reorganizing under constant pressure for days or weeks before the ring around them had even fully closed. The scale of prisoners taken in these encirclements, reaching well into the hundreds of thousands at Bialystok and Minsk alone, exceeded anything Soviet military planning had prepared for, and devastated the trained, experienced corps of the pre-war Red Army in a matter of weeks, rather than the months or years such losses might ordinarily have taken to accumulate. Before we get into the remaining 3 tactics that made this opening summer so devastating, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. Tactic number 3, and it happened in the campaign's very first hours, rather than developing gradually over the following weeks, the way the encirclements themselves eventually did. The Luftwaffe launched a coordinated series of strikes against Soviet airfields at dawn on June the 22nd, catching a substantial portion of the Soviet Air Force still parked on the ground in neat, orderly rows that had never anticipated an attack of this scale, arriving without any formal declaration of war preceding it in the customary diplomatic fashion. More than 2,000 Soviet aircraft were destroyed within the campaign's opening day alone, the overwhelming majority of them destroyed on the ground before their own pilots had any real chance to get airborne and contest German control of the skies above the advancing Panzer columns pushing deeper into Soviet territory below them. A result so lopsided that some Luftwaffe pilots involved in the opening strikes reportedly found themselves running short of ammunition and fuel simply from the sheer number of undefended stationary targets available to them across dozens of Soviet airfields struck simultaneously that first morning. That single morning's destruction gave German forces something close to total air superiority across the entire front for the campaign's critical opening weeks, letting German aircraft support the advancing Panzer spearheads and strike Soviet reinforcements moving up to the front, with only minimal interference from a Soviet air force that had, in a matter of hours, lost a meaningful fraction of its entire pre-war strength before most of its own pilots had even finished their breakfast that morning. Tactic number 4, and it gave German commanders an advantage in the actual tempo of battlefield decision-making that proved just as important as any single weapon system or piece of equipment either side actually possessed on paper. German tanks and command vehicles were far more thoroughly equipped with radios than their Soviet counterparts, letting German commanders coordinate rapidly changing battlefield situations in real time, redirecting individual tank companies and battalions within minutes of a new opportunity or threat actually emerging on the ground in front of them, rather than hours later once a report had worked its way back through several layers of command, and a response had been drafted, approved, and finally transmitted back down to the units that actually needed it most urgently. Soviet forces, by contrast, often relied on more limited radio equipment distributed unevenly across their own units, forcing many Soviet commanders to rely on runners, field telephones tied to fixed lines vulnerable to being cut by advancing German forces, or simply waiting for a scheduled report to understand what was actually happening at the front. A communication lag that let German forces consistently act faster than Soviet commanders could actually respond to changing circumstances unfolding around them. That gap in battlefield tempo, invisible in any simple count of tanks or aircraft on either side of the front, let German units repeatedly exploit openings and opportunities that a slower, less well-connected Soviet command structure simply could not identify and respond to quickly enough to prevent before the moment had already passed. Tactic number 5, and it reflected years of careful pre-war planning around exactly how modern combined arms warfare was actually supposed to function once real fighting began, rather than any improvisation invented for this specific campaign. German doctrine emphasized close, practice coordination between infantry, armour, artillery, and air support, each branch trained specifically to support the others in a single, unified tactical scheme, rather than operating as largely separate forces loosely coordinated after the fact, once a battle had already begun to unfold. Panzer spearheads advanced with direct air support, calling in strikes against Soviet positions blocking their path, while following infantry divisions moved up to secure the ground. Armour had already broken through, and reduced pockets of resistance panzers themselves were not well suited to clearing on their own, without dismounted soldiers to actually occupy captured ground. That practice coordination, refined across the campaigns in Poland and France that had preceded Barbarossa, and drilled repeatedly during the extensive training periods German units underwent before the invasion actually began, let German forces respond to unexpected Soviet resistance with a flexibility and speed that a Red Army still reorganizing its own officer corps after Stalin's pre-war purges struggled to match in the campaign's opening months. Its own most experienced commanders, having been removed from positions of authority only a few years earlier under circumstances that had nothing to do with military competence. Individual panzer groups provided some of the clearest evidence of how effectively these tactics actually worked in practice, rather than merely on the planning maps back in Berlin. Panzer Group 2, commanded by General Heinz Guderian, one of the most aggressive practitioners of concentrated armoured warfare in the entire German army, advanced so far and so fast during the campaign's opening weeks that it repeatedly outpaced the infantry divisions meant to be securing the ground behind it. A gap between fast-moving armour and slower-moving infantry that would eventually become a genuine vulnerability. But that, through the summer of 1941, simply meant Guderian's own tanks kept finding themselves deep behind Soviet lines with room to manoeuvre freely before organised resistance could reform in front of them. Panzer Group 3, advancing further north under General Hermann Hoth, achieved similarly dramatic results, the two panzer groups eventually meeting behind Soviet forces near Minsk to close one of the campaign's largest and most consequential encirclements in the war's opening weeks. A pincer movement that depended entirely on both commanders' trust in their own subordinates to maintain the pace and coordination the entire manoeuvre actually required across hundreds of miles of contested territory. What made this summer of tactics so effective? Let's set the 5 approaches side by side before looking at how they actually reinforced each other in practice. Because together they trace a pattern of coordinated success no single German unit's own after-action report could have captured entirely on its own. Tactic 1. Concentrated Panzer spearheads punched through Soviet lines at a small number of carefully chosen points, rather than spreading armour evenly across the entire front, exploiting weaknesses rather than testing strength everywhere at once. Tactic 2. Those spearheads then swung around to encircle massive Soviet forces in cauldron battles that produced hundreds of thousands of prisoners at Bialystok, Minsk and Smolensk alone, trapping entire armies before they could organize a coherent withdrawal. Tactic 3. A devastating opening strike against Soviet airfields destroyed more than 2,000 aircraft within the first day and handed German forces air superiority across the entire front for the campaign's critical opening weeks. A single morning's work with consequences that lasted for months. Tactic 4. Superior radio equipment let German commanders coordinate battlefield decisions considerably faster than their Soviet counterparts could actually respond to changing circumstances on the ground. A communications advantage worth more in practice than any single additional tank or aircraft might have been. Tactic 5. Practice combined arms coordination between infantry, armour, artillery and air support let German forces respond to unexpected resistance with a flexibility Soviet forces initially struggled to match, given their own officer corps' recent and painful reorganization. These 5 tactics did not operate independently of each other, and understanding how directly they reinforced one another explains the summer's overwhelming results better than examining any single approach alone ever could on its own terms. The air superiority established in Tactic 3 gave the concentrated Panzer spearheads in Tactic 1 room to operate with minimal interference from above, advancing rapidly into open country without the kind of sustained air attack that might otherwise have slowed their own advance considerably or forced them to move more cautiously than their own doctrine actually called for. The superior communications in Tactic 4. Let those same spearheads actually execute the encirclement manoeuvres described in Tactic 2 with a precision and speed. A less well-coordinated force could never have managed, closing rings around trapped Soviet armies before those armies could reorganize and fight their way out, while the pocket was still forming rather than already sealed shut behind them. And the combined arms doctrine in Tactic 5 meant that once a Kesselschlacht had actually been formed, German forces possessed exactly the mixed infantry, artillery and air support needed to methodically reduce the trapped pocket and force a mass surrender, rather than simply holding a ring of tanks around an enemy force that might otherwise have found some way to break out through a purely armoured cordon alone. A cordon armour could establish quickly but rarely maintain indefinitely without infantry support arriving to make the encirclement genuinely permanent. The results of that combination became clear within the campaign's opening weeks in numbers that stunned observers on every side of the conflict, allies and enemies alike, struggling to process the scale of what German forces had actually achieved in barely a month of fighting. By early July, German forces had advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory along multiple axes of the front simultaneously, a rate of advance that outpaced even the most optimistic pre-war German planning estimates for how quickly the campaign might unfold. Soviet losses in men, equipment and aircraft during the campaign's first month alone exceeded anything either side had experienced in the opening phase of any previous major war in modern history. A scale of destruction that led some German commanders and officials to believe, prematurely as it eventually turned out, that the Soviet Union's own capacity to continue resisting was already approaching total collapse. General Franz Halder, the German army's own chief of staff, wrote in his private diary in early July that it was probably no overstatement to say the campaign against Russia had been won within the first 2 weeks of fighting, a judgment that reflected genuine confidence among senior German commanders rather than simple propaganda intended for public consumption back home. A private assessment written for Halder's own eyes, rather than for any wider audience that might have reason to doubt it. That confidence, built on 5 tactics that had genuinely delivered everything German planners had hoped for across the campaign's opening summer, ultimately proved to be the invasion's own most dangerous weakness, rather than a reliable guide to how the rest of the war would actually unfold in the months that followed. The same tactical successes that destroyed so many Soviet armies in the campaign's opening weeks also convinced German planners the underlying strategic gamble behind the entire invasion, that Soviet resistance would collapse before Germany's own supply lines, equipment and soldiers were worn down by the sheer scale of the country they were fighting to conquer, had already been vindicated beyond any reasonable doubt. Soviet manpower reserves, considerably deeper than German intelligence had estimated before the invasion began, kept producing new armies to replace the ones destroyed in each successive cauldron battle. Fresh divisions raised and thrown into the fighting faster than German planners had believed the Soviet system was capable of managing. And the same 5 tactics that had made the opening summer appear unstoppable proved considerably harder to sustain once autumn rains turned Soviet roads to mud, and a brutal winter arrived for which German forces had made no serious preparation at all. The same speed and coordination that had defined the summer campaign finding no equivalent answer to weather. Neither side could actually outplan or outmaneuver. The infantry divisions marching behind those advancing Panzer spearheads deserved their own share of credit for the campaign's opening successes, a detail the popular focus on tanks and aircraft sometimes obscures. German infantry, marching on foot or moving by horse-drawn wagon across terrain that offered few paved roads of any kind, sustained a pace of advance that itself exceeded what most pre-war military planners on either side had believed a large infantry force could realistically maintain over weeks of continuous movement. Reaching and reducing pockets, the Panzer spearheads had already encircled before those trapped Soviet forces could organize any serious breakout attempt of their own. That sustained marching pace, unglamorous compared to the dramatic tank advances that dominated newsreel coverage of the campaign, actually determined how quickly each individual cauldron battle could actually be closed and finished, since a Kesselschlacht remained vulnerable to a determined breakout for as long as the encircling ring consisted of thin, overextended panzer units alone, without the infantry, artillery, and heavier firepower needed to make the encirclement genuinely airtight against a Soviet force fighting for its own survival. The rest of the world watched the campaign's opening weeks with a mixture of shock and grim recalculation of its own strategic assumptions. British and American observers, who had generally expected the Soviet Union to hold out for at most a few months against a full German invasion, found their own private estimates repeatedly revised downward as reports of new encirclements and mounting prisoner counts continued arriving through the summer. Some intelligence assessments in London and Washington, briefly concluding Soviet collapse, might come even faster than the pessimistic timelines already being discussed in private briefings. German state radio and newsreels, for their own part, broadcast the summer's victories with an enthusiasm that reflected genuine confidence among propaganda officials, rather than simple wartime exaggeration. Footage of endless columns of Soviet prisoners marching west presented as visual proof that the campaign's 5 core tactics were delivering exactly the swift, decisive victory German planners had promised the German public back in June. This is not a story about tactics that failed, since each of these 5 approaches performed on its own narrow terms exactly as German planners had designed them to across the campaign's opening months of fighting. It is a story about how completely a tactically brilliant summer can obscure a strategically unsound campaign underneath it. 5 approaches that delivered genuine, overwhelming battlefield success against an enemy that kept absorbing catastrophic losses without actually collapsing the way German planners had confidently assumed it eventually would once enough of its armies had been encircled and destroyed. An assumption that turned out to rest on a fundamental miscalculation about the sheer depth of Soviet manpower and industrial capacity no amount of tactical brilliance on any single battlefield could ever have fully compensated for. The same concentrated spearheads, encirclement tactics, air superiority, communications advantage, and combined arms coordination that made Barbarossa appear unstoppable. Through the summer of 1941, were still winning individual battles right up until the moment German forces found themselves fighting outside Moscow in December, with none of those tactical advantages sufficient, on their own, to overcome a Soviet Union that had absorbed everything the campaign's opening tactics could throw at it and kept fighting anyway. A strategic resilience. No single tactical innovation, however well executed on any given day of fighting, had ever actually been designed to overcome on its own. If you want more stories about the tactics that won every battle in a war that was ultimately lost anyway, subscribe and we will keep finding them. One meticulously researched campaign at a time. See you in the next one.